Alright, so for Module 6, Lesson 8, we're still going to be working with arrays. So over here, for number 1, it says create an array with the squares of course being these right here. And it looks like I've got a space for 2 groups, and those groups happen to be rows, so I've got spaces right here for those. So I'm going to come over here and see how many cubes I have. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Okay, so I can start drawing these over here. So I'm going to go one at a time. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I want you to notice that I'm going back and forth between these two. That's so that I get the squares evenly distributed between the groups, okay? So I've got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So that works out to 2 rows of 5, okay? 2 rows of 5. Then we come down to number 2, and it says create an array with the squares from the set above. So it's just using these squares down here, okay? So we still have 10 squares, and it looks like we have columns that we're going to be putting them in. So let's see how many columns that we need to make. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 spaces for these. So I would come in here and I would do exactly like what I did up here by putting 1 square in each column until I've used all 10, okay? So why don't you go ahead and pause and give that a shot. Alright, so for number 3, it says use the array of squares to answer the questions below. So we see we have our array right here. Looks like we've got 2 rows of 5, just like we had in our problem earlier. So it says there are blank squares in each row, so I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So you just take how many squares there are in each row and you'd write it right there. Then what they want you to do is take the number in each row and add them up and find how many squares you have total. So you would write that right here. So that's how many squares there are total, right in the circle, okay? And then they want you to come back and count the columns, okay? So there are blank squares in each column. Now remember, rows, they go back and forth or side to side. Columns, they go up and down, okay? So rows are back and forth, columns are up and down. Now, of course, since we're doing columns for this problem right here, you'll need to use the columns to fill in your repeated addition down here. So you'd simply take the number from each column and put it in this blank. So here's the row right here. And so you would take this, you'd put it right here, and then here is the column, and you would take this number and put it in these blanks down here. So for number 4, we're still using the array to answer the questions. So first you want to look at how many squares are in one row. So remember, this right here is a row. Then we come and we look at this, and it says there are blank squares in one column. So I would come in here and be like, okay, so this is how many squares are in one column. Then I would take a look at this, and it says blank plus blank plus blank equals blank, right? So let's think about this for just a second. There are 3 blanks, which means we need 3 numbers to put in there, okay? So let's look at our rows first. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. So that's 1, 2, 3. So that's not going to work. I'm not going to be able to use my rows. Let's take a look at the columns now. We've got 1, 2, 3 columns. I've got 3 blanks. So you want to use the number from the columns to put in these blanks, and then put the total right here in the circle. Then, of course, you would come here and go 3 columns of blank is equal to blank rows of blank. So really what they're getting at is how do you make these equal, okay? So we've got our rows just like this, and so we've got 4 rows with a certain number in each group. Then we'd come back and we'd take a look at the columns. And so we can use the same array and get to the same number 2 different ways, and so that's what they're trying to help us with right here. So we've got 4 rows and 3 columns, and so you would use that information to help you fill in this right here. Alright, so moving on to the next problem. It says draw an array with 8 squares that has 2 squares in each column. So you need to use 8 squares with 2 squares in each column. Okay, so 2 squares in a column. Remember, columns go up and down. So this is an example of 2 squares in a column. Then you need to make sure that you use 8 squares total. So you would want to draw those in this area over here, okay? Then, of course, you write the repeated addition equation to match what you did right here. So it would be, of course, 2 plus 2, and then you would go on down and do that until you reach 8. So it's basically just showing mathematically how you drew them out 2 at a time. Alright, so number 6 is exactly the same, except you need to use 20 squares, and you need 4 squares in each column, so each column would have 4 squares. Remember that columns go up and down. Then you would write the repeated addition equation to match that, and then a tape diagram to match the repeated addition equation. Okay, so tape diagram. So once again from the lesson, what this would look like is I would go ahead and draw out my big old tape diagram. And I'd come in here and I'd break it up, and then I would put the number from each column in there. So for example, this should have the number 4 in each of these, so each of these would have the number 4, so you'd fill in 4, 4, and 4, just like that. Alright, so moving on to the homework. I would do this exactly the same way as on the problem set. So I would come in here and I'd just label these until I figure out how many I have. So I've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Okay, so then I'd come in here and I'd draw these one at a time until I get all the way to 12. So I've got 4, 5, 6, and then you would just do the rest right in here. Then you would take those 12 and you do the exact same thing down here, except you'd be doing it in 1, 2, 3, 4 columns instead of 2 rows. Moving on, of course, just like on the problem set, you would use the array of squares to answer the questions. So there are blank squares in each row. Now remember, this right here is a row. And then you would fill in this repeated addition with the numbers that you get from the rows, okay? Then you would come over here, and there are blank squares in each column. Now remember, this is a column, so how many squares are in the column? Then you would use that information and plug it into these blanks down here for your repeated addition. Moving on to number 4, pretty much exactly the same. Couple extra questions, it looks like. Couple different questions, I should say. So of course you would just use the information that you get from this to fill in the blanks down here. Then for number 5, you need to draw an array with 15 squares that has 3 squares in each column. So 3 squares in each column. So you would simply come over here and start drawing squares. So here's a column of 3, and you would do that and make another column and another column until you get all the way to 15, okay? Then you write a repeated addition sentence to match that. And then of course, moving on to number 6, it's pretty much exactly the same. You draw it out, repeated addition, but then you do the tape diagram, just like what we did on the problem set. So hopefully this is helpful, and we will see you tomorrow.